Friends, there's a claim spreading across social media that I believe needs to be challenged, and you have probably seen it. The claim is that Jamaicans have access to less than 1% of Jamaica's beaches. Sometimes the claim goes even further, that Jamaicans have supposedly been locked out of their coastline, that hotels have taken the beaches, foreigners control the shore, ordinary Jamaicans can barely get to the sea in their own country. It is an emotionally powerful argument. There is just one major problem with those arguments: the numbers being used to prove it. That's a problem. And today I want to deal with this claim directly, not emotionally, not politically, not because I support one political party or another, but because if we are going to have a serious conversation about Jamaica, then we must start with facts. And the first fact destroys the foundation of the 1% argument. There's a list of approximately 60 public bathing beaches offering free access spread across the country. And look at the North Coast alone. Let's break it down. Hanover has Orchard Old Steamer, Trial Beach, Bulls Bay, Lances Bay, and Watson Taylor Park. St. James has Sunset Beach, Dead End, Coral Gardens, Success, Greenwood, and Barrett Hall. Trelawney has Rio Bruno, Flamingo, Half Moon Bay, and Jacob Taylor Silver Sands. St. Anne includes Prairie, Fantasy, Bengal, Cardiff Hall, Flavors, Salem, Sharkeys, and Roxborough. St. Mary includes Page, Frontier, Anotta Bay, Markingstone, Rio Nueve, and Murdoch. Portland includes Hope Bay, St. Margaret's Bay, Innis Bay, Bryan's Bay, Long Bay, Blue Hole, Drapers, and Winifred Beach. And those are not imaginary places. Jamaicans actually use them. So when somebody tells you Jamaicans can't access their beaches, I would say ask a very simple question. What exactly do you mean by can't access? Jamaica's coastline is not one giant beach. That is a mistake at the center of this entire claim. As Edmund Bartlett, the Minister of Tourism, would have pointed out, Jamaica has 2,200 kilometers of coastline. But coastline does not mean beach. Let me repeat that. Coastline does not mean beach. Along the coastline, there are cliffs, there are rocks, there are mangroves, there are wetlands, there are harbors, there are fishing areas, and there are sections where entering the water would be difficult, dangerous, or completely impractical, not to mention unsafe. Yet when people compare the length of designated public beaches with Jamaica's entire coastline, they create a percentage that sounds shocking. Less than 1%. But 1% of what? That is the question we should be asking. 1% of what? Because if your denominator includes cliffs, rocks, mangrove, wetlands, harbors, and coastline that was never a recreational beach in the first place, then the resulting percentage tells us very little about how much usable beach Jamaicans actually have to access. Tourism Minister Edmund Bartlett addressed precisely this issue. He said only about 29% of Jamaica's coastline represents areas containing sand, and only about 22% is suitable for swimming and beach activities. Now, suddenly, the picture looks very different. You cannot take 2,200 kilometers of coastline, pretend all 2,200 kilometers are beautiful swimming beaches, compare that with officially designated public bathing beaches, and then announce, look, Jamaicans have lost 99% of their beaches. I believe that is not a fair representation of the geography. And there's another problem with this argument. You see, people see a figure for the numbers of officially designated bathing beaches, and assume those are the only places where Jamaicans can access the sea. Again, that does not follow. A beach being officially designated as a public bathing beach is not the same thing as saying every other piece of accessible coastline is forbidden to Jamaicans. Those are two completely different propositions. Yet, social media repeatedly blurs that distinction, and once those distinctions disappear, the narrative becomes very simple. Public beach equals Jamaican access. Now, everything else equals private and inaccessible. But Jamaica's coastline simply doesn't work that way. Now, let us deal with another impression being created. If you listened only to social media, you could easily believe that public beaches have lost or have almost disappeared from Jamaica, I should say. Well, they haven't. There is a difference between saying Jamaica needs more quality public beaches, which is a perfectly legitimate argument, and saying Jamaicans have essentially been barred from their coastline. Those are not the same claim at all. But here's another fact that rarely accompanies the viral posts. Of roughly 70 recognized public beaches cited in this debate, only around 10 are commercially operated, and only 5 reportedly charge an entrance fee. Think about that for a moment, my friends. Then compare it with the impression being created online. The narrative says Jamaicans are being forced to pay simply to see their own sea. But the actual picture is far more complicated. The fact is that most recognized public beaches are not charging Jamaicans an entrance fee. Now, should Jamaica have more, should I say, properly maintained free beaches? I would say so. Should existing public beaches have better bathrooms? Absolutely. Better parking? Yes. Better security? Yes. More lifeguards? Definitely. Cleaner surroundings and better facilities? Without question, yes. But that is an infrastructure argument. It is not evidence that Jamaicans have been expelled from their coastline. And that distinction matters. Now, let us deal with the hotels. Yes, Jamaica has beachfront hotels. Of course it does. It better. Else we wouldn't be a tourist destination. Jamaica is one of the world's major tourism destinations. Tourists come partly because of the beaches. Hotels therefore build along sections of the coastline. But sometimes the conversation makes it sound as though tourism development itself is proof that Jamaicans are losing Jamaica. And that argument ignores the other side of the equation. The fact of the matter is that hotels employ Jamaicans. Restaurants employ Jamaicans. Taxi operators depend on tourists. Farmers supply hotels. Entertainers perform in hotels. Construction workers build them. Thousands of small businesses depend directly or indirectly upon tourism. And of course, foreign exchange generated by tourism flows throughout the Jamaican economy. We can't argue that. So we cannot simultaneously demand economic development and then treat every hotel built around the coastline as automatic evidence of national dispossession. We can't do that. The issue should be responsible development. Responsible development that protects communities. Responsible development that protects legitimate access. Development that recognizes the importance of the tourism industry while ensuring Jamaicans are not pushed aside. That is a conversation we should be having. Not development versus Jamaicans. And this brings me to something else that gets confused constantly in this type of debate. Access and amenities are not the same thing. Someone visits a public beach. There isn't a beautiful changing room. The parking isn't ideal. There aren't enough bathrooms. Maybe there isn't a restaurant. Then they look next door at a resort. Beautiful landscaping, beach chairs, bathroom, security, restaurants. And somebody says, see, tourists have the beach and Jamaicans don't. Not at all. What you have demonstrated is a difference in amenities. You have just demonstrated a difference in amenities. This is not necessarily a difference in access. A hotel guest has paid hundreds of dollars, sometimes thousands of dollars, for accommodation and resort facilities. Naturally, the hotel provides amenities. That doesn't prove Jamaicans have no access to the sea. If the argument is that Jamaica's public beaches should receive greater investment, as I said earlier, then let us make that argument, right? I would support that conversation, but I don't know how we get to the argument halfway through and the other equation is not shown. Don't start by saying Jamaicans have no beaches. That's just sensational. And then when somebody produces a list of public beaches, suddenly say, yes, but the hotels has nicer bathrooms. Those are two different arguments. You see where I'm going with this? And perhaps nowhere is this clearer than on Jamaica's North Coast. The North Coast is supposed to be the strongest evidence for the argument that Jamaicans have lost the coastline. Well, that is where many of Jamaica's major hotels are located. Montego Bay, Negril, Ocho Rios, Runaway Bay are in play. Yet even across those tourism-intensive beach parishes, public beaches continue to exist. Hanover has them, St. James has them, Trelawney has them, St. Ann has them, St. Mary has them, Portland has them. And so the claim cannot simply be hotels came and therefore Jamaicans lost the coast. The evidence doesn't support such a simplistic conclusion at all. Not if we're doing our research and we are really genuinely wanting the facts. But I also want to be fair, because rejecting exaggeration does not mean pretending Jamaica has no beach access problems. There have been disputes over traditional access routes. There have been communities concerned about development. There have been fishermen worried about access. There are public beaches that need major improvement. And there are places, if you travel around Jamaica, where Jamaicans understandably believe development has changed their relationship with the coastline. We can argue that. And if we argue from that point, then those concerns deserve attention. They should not be dismissed. But none of those things automatically proves that Jamaicans have access to less than 1% of their beaches. Not true at all. And this is where we have to become disciplined. A legitimate grievance does not validate an inaccurate statistic. You don't need misinformation to make a good argument. If a community has lost a traditional access point, investigate it. If fishermen are being prevented from reaching areas they have traditionally used, address it. If developers are violating agreements, hold them accountable. If public beaches are being neglected, demand investment. Matter of fact, you can invest in them yourselves. Those are real issues. But don't take those real issues and attach a make-up statistic to them that the mathematics doesn't support. And so, my friends, the next time somebody tells you Jamaicans have access to less than 1% of their beaches, ask a question. Ask him a question. 1% of what? 1% of Jamaica's entire coastline? 1% of sandy coastline? 1% of swimmable coastline? 1% of the officially designated bathing beaches? 1% of beaches with facilities? 1% of beaches accessible without crossing private property? You see how we're breaking it down? You see how facts matters? Statistics is one thing, because those measurements are completely different. And if the person cannot tell you which one they mean, then the statistic is practically meaningless. You see, here's the thing. Numbers sound authoritative, and I work with numbers every day. Put a percentage sign behind something, and suddenly it sounds scientific. It sounds researched. It sounds undeniable. But a number without context can mislead just as effectively as a false statement. And this is why I believe we need to move the conversation somewhere more productive. Lamenting is one thing. Worst is lamenting where the facts doesn't support the lament. Instead of telling Jamaicans that 99% of their beaches have disappeared, demand something constructive. Demand that the public beaches need to be improved. Demand proper bathrooms, improve parking, lifeguards, keep them clean, improve security, protect legitimate traditional access points, ensure fishermen retain necessary access, create new public beaches where communities are underserved. And then when major coastal developments are approved, we should ensure that access is part of the planning conversation. That is a serious national policy discussion. That is accountability. Because if we reject the idea that Jamaica should simply hand over its coastline without considering the interests of its people, then that's unfair ground. But I also reject the opposite extreme. The idea that Jamaica has somehow become one giant walled-off resort where foreigners sit comfortably beside the Caribbean Sea while Jamaicans stand behind fences looking through the bars. I mean, that is not Jamaica. Some of us need to go around the country. Go to Portland, go to St. Mary, go to St. Anne, go to Trelawney, go to St. James, go to Hanover, go to the South Coast. I see them for myself. Jamaicans are swimming, Jamaicans are fishing, Jamaicans are cooking, Jamaicans are playing football. Families are gathering. Children are running into the water. People are enjoying their coastline every single day. Could access be better? Yes. Could facilities be better? Absolutely. I've seen some of them. Should government protect public access as development continues? Without question. Should developers be held accountable where legitimate access rights are threatened or infringed? Of course. But that is a long way from saying Jamaicans have been locked out of 99% of their beaches. Doing that and saying that is just giving Jamaica a bad name overseas. And there's another reason this matters. Jamaica is not having this conversation privately, as I mentioned that. The world is watching. A claim begins on Facebook, it moves to TikTok, then it moves to YouTube, then somebody overseas repeats it, and before long, this story becomes Jamaica sold all its beaches to foreigners. Think about what that says about the country. Think about what that does to Jamaica's reputation, something that is not even true. And more importantly, ask whether it is true. Criticize government when criticism is deserved. Challenge the developers, demand accountability, protect communities, fight for fishermen, demand better public beaches by all means. Those things are part of democracy. But Jamaica should not have to destroy its own reputation to solve its problems. We can demand better without pretending everything is terrible. We can protect Jamaica without misrepresenting Jamaica. Some of us are very good at it. We have a degree in that. And we can challenge development without pretending tourism is the enemy. So, my friends, the next time somebody tells you Jamaicans only have access to 1% of their beaches, don't trust them. And don't just share it. Don't just become angry. Don't just cuss the government. Don't allow the percentage itself to end the conversation. And by the way, it wouldn't be just one government at fault if that was so. Remember that. Ask where did that number come from? What exactly is being measured? Right? And I remind you, finally, you have to ask, does coastline mean beach? Does public bathing beach mean the only coastline Jamaican can access? How many free beaches there are? Public beaches? Ask that question. What percentage of Jamaica's coastline is actually sandy? How do you come up with your percentage? What percentage is suitable for swimming and beach activities? Because once you start asking those questions, the sensational headline begins to fall apart, as I am taking it apart here. And if you're fair and objective, you'll see that I've torn it apart. And there's an important distinction here, by the way. Saying Jamaica should have more and better public beach access is one argument. Saying Jamaicans have lost 99% of their beaches is another argument entirely. You see, the viral statistic simply does not provide any background, right? There's no background to the statistics that's been promulgated and, sent here, there, and everywhere. We no doubt have to protect, our communities. We no doubt have to hold government accountable. We no doubt have to hold developers accountable. But the one thing we tend not to hold accountable? Social media. But we have to hold that accountable too. Because misinformation doesn't become truth simply because it goes viral. And outrage doesn't turn bad mathematics into good mathematics. Jamaica has not lost its coastline. Jamaicans have not been banished from their beaches. There are legitimate issues surrounding access, and so let us ask deeper questions when we hear something. Ask what they counted, ask what they divided, ask them whether they are measuring coastlines, sandy coastlines, swimmable coastlines, public bathing beaches, or something else entirely. Why? Because facts don't become less important simply because outrage gets more clicks. And Jamaica does not need misinformation to make the case for better access to Jamaica's beaches. If the truth is strong enough, then use it. Truth is strong enough, and only truth we should use. If we don't have the facts, if we don't have the truth, then ask the questions and demand the answers. Until next time, my dear friends, remember, out of many, one people, one Jamaica, land we love, under God. See you next time.
Jamaica, here we come. One